t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as fait manquer, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles, Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show about the week that was. On Brussels, my love, we zoom in on some of the stories making news across the continent. Hear what's at stake for you and for Europe. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, fury in France. The country of 68 million is knee-deep in divisions and reflection over the killing of a French teen during a recent police check. Long simmering issues of identity and inclusion now boiling over. We take a closer look, ask who is to blame and check if Europe has failed to better integrate minorities. And report cards for EU member states. The EU Commission presented its annual Rule of Law report this week, saying the situation across the EU was stable, even hailing some judiciary improvements in countries like Hungary. But with concerns of corruption, media independence and journalists even being spied on in some parts of this continent, we scrutinise how helpful this annual report really is. Our guests this week, Emmanuel Ashiri, policy expert on policing and migration at ENAR. Welcome.
Thank you.
Abir Al-Salani, Swedish MEP from the Renew Europe group.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Good to have you with us. And also Matteo Albania, Communications Director at Must & Partners. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Now, before we hear your thoughts, we just want to rewind back the clock, perhaps, for some context. Ellie La Liberté has more.
A wave of violence has shaken France after police shot a teenager dead during a traffic stop. The death sparked protests, which quickly degenerated into street fires, serious property damage, and even looting in many French cities. Tens of thousands of police were deployed, thousands of arrests were made, and many of those involved minors. Why all this fury? Protesters say it's systemic racism within the policing system. The government wants to subdue the violence. This fierce French conflict asks the question, what is the deep-rooted issue? Is integration in Europe a failure?
Ellie La Liberté reporting for us there. So I guess the first question to you all, what is the deep-rooted issue? What is your take on it?
I would first like to start by saying that we at ENA prefer not to use the term integration, because integration means bringing someone or group and assimilating them in a society, and we prefer to use the term inclusion, which means creating an enabling environment for people of different races, groups to actually live comfortably. And we think that the issue in France currently, this is not just about one death. This is not a coincidence. This is about systemic racism within French policing, but it's also about systemic racism within wider French society, which needs to be addressed. And I think that the human rights UN human rights body brought this up a couple of days ago, which of course was rejected by the French. We know in 2021 as well, a couple of human rights organizations, including Amnesty, Open Society and Human Rights Watch, had brought a case against the French police for systemic discrimination against blacks and Arabs.
But of course the French, we heard from Bruno Le Maire, the French minister, saying that the police force in France were absolutely not racist. And just on your use of that word integration, funny, the European Union has a plan and it's called an action plan for integration and inclusion. So you probably dislike that term. But let's hear from yourself. Let's get the MEP point of view around the table.
I think that these riots, these uprisings are just the symptoms of the disease that is at hand that we have in our societies. I'm from Sweden myself, and I very well know how it is to be outside and left outside the system, outside society. But we need to address the disease in itself. And it is actually offering equal opportunities for all. And the feeling, systematic feeling of being excluded, of not being belonging to this society, to this community, on one hand, but also not feeling that the police are there to protect me, that the law is there to protect me. We need to address that issue. Why do we feel alienated? Or why are these groups feeling alienated to the law that is there to protect them, to the police enforcement that is there to protect them?
And that's we're discussing here third generation French. I mean, they feel left out here and they also feel left out when they go back home as well. Matteo, what's your take on the situation?
I think that the economic growth that we've seen in Europe in the last decades has left out chunks of populations. I mean, not only third or fourth generations of North African people, but also Europeans. And when you leave out these big chunks of population, the result is that you're going to have discontent, you're going to have anger, and anger is going to translate in that because they're being left out, they feel they don't have the same opportunities. At the same time, we have to also to reflect on the fact that there is no European integration model. There is a France model, there is a Germany model, there is a Spain model, but there is not really one European model.
Indeed, and there might be this EU Commission plan on the table, but of course it is a competence of the EU member states. But I just want to bring in the opinion of a man who's been screaming from the rooftops for years about this issue. It's the civil rights well-known lawyer Juan Branco. He believes that nothing has changed in France since the riots of 2005. Take a listen.
There is clearly in France a problem of segregation in general, which has brought parts of society not to communicate with each other. And therefore, fantasies and violence rise from this lack of communication. Parts of France which are suffering very violently from the current policies that have been adopted in the last years or even decades related to the lack of public services and so forth. And this has created a lot of animosity, which bring parts of society to oppose each other instead of fight against the real responsibles of the situation. So what is certain is that this policeman would have never behaved as such in one of the neighbors of the center of Paris. He would have never dared to treat as such a citizen of white color in a privileged neighborhood.
Juan Branco there speaking to our Paul Larocque Opino. So I guess would you agree with that this would never have happened in a posh district like the 16th district, for example, of
But of
Paris?
course, I mean, there is structural discrimination. And if you don't take the mirror as a society and look at yourself with open eyes, taking in all perspectives, then you will not be representing everyone, and then you will be representing just a certain group. And this is, I think, what the French society has to do as a whole. Take a mirror and have a good look and invite everyone to participate in the discussion to improve the society for everyone. Maybe the persons with disabilities, maybe for persons with color, maybe for the ethnic French people as well, the chunk that you said they were left out. Everyone has to participate.
And has Emmanuel Macron, the French president, handled this well?
Well, I mean, it's handled in the French way. It's not the Macron way. And it doesn't matter who would have been the president, it will be handled in the exact same way, from the left to the right.
How should he be handling this?
The first thing is to listen to the protesters. Rather, what we are seeing is the instrumentalization of the criminal justice system to arrest many teens and use the criminal justice system to kind of deter people from going out to the streets to protest. I think it's also very important that an independent committee is set up to investigate this murder, because you cannot be asking the very same institution that is responsible for this systemic racism, the racial profiling, to be the very same system to deliver justice. People need to feel that they have confidence and trust in the French judicial system, and people don't feel that way currently in France.
At the same time, we need to actually address the violence.
I was going to say, how do you have a conversation with people when they're being extremely violent?
Yeah, it is very difficult, and I really, I mean, I believe in everyone's right to demonstrate, to, say their opinion, and that is how a democracy should be working. But then taking into violence, that is also taking it into the next step, and that's why we need really actually, or the French need really to do this in the proper way, because you do not want also to undermine the justice system. That is the only system that will, sustain.
But I want to add to that we should also listen to the reasoning of those who have in the last years been voting for the far right. I think that for too long we have been ostracizing them, and now we see that they are growing also in other countries, in Sweden. And for too long we have been thinking about doing, creating the cordon sanitaire in France, making sure that Macron or pro-European leaders were elected, but we failed to understand why these people were voting for these parties. We failed also to understand their concerns. We just thought that they were fueled by populism and by communication propaganda, but I think we did fail to listen to their concerns as well.
And these are the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, because when you listen to far-right politicians like Marie Le Pen or Eric Zemmour, I struggle to understand what you want to listen from people who spew hate speech, from people who choose to blame migrants for the problems in Europe rather than actually looking at the systemic issues that are responsible for those issues. So I think that while it is important to have a conversation, while it's important to listen, we also need to have a conversation that is respectable, a conversation that values what we consider as European values, human rights, respect for other communities. But that is not the message we are getting from the far right.
Well, we have to listen to everyone's point of view, and we actually had the opportunity to speak to a man who is very close to Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen. He is the well-known, controversial perhaps, media commentator Jean Messia, and he set up a crowdfunding campaign that brought about some 1.5 million euros for the policeman, for the legal costs of the policeman. And he feels that Niall, the 17-year-old teen that lost his life back in late June, he believes that he plays also a responsibility. Take a listen to this.
I consider Niall, and this is a fact, to be a multi-offender delinquent. So sure, he has a clean criminal record, but that's down to the laxity of the justice system, because he's been brought before the courts several times. The family should have done better from the outset to rein in their youngster. What family has a 17-year-old who drives around without a license in a luxury car worth 90,000 euros, and who, when the police call him to obey, decides to step on the accelerator? If this young man had simply complied, got out of his car calmly, and turned off the engine, he wouldn't be dead. In this case, Niall committed suicide. Nothing more, nothing less.
Jean Messia there speaking to our Paul Larocque-Oppenau. Reaction to that?
I mean, it's very strange and weird to hear him say this because there are rules for a certain reason. The response to someone violating traffic rules is not shooting them point blank range. So while we could debate about whether Nahel was raised the right way or not, and none of us can say that at this point in time, but the fact remains is that the response was unjustified, and the response was based on a racial profiling. The response is something which is also common as well in French policing. This is not the first time we are seeing this.
And we've seen studies from the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, that back up that there is racial profiling taking place as we speak.
And I would like to ask
you,
has he raised his children properly? Do we know that? Can he ensure me that his white-ass children never committed a crime, never used drugs, never beat anyone? He cannot guarantee that he can. But he is privileged, and that's why he doesn't need to justify his own upbringing of his own children. If they cannot see that they are privileged and they are using that position of power, then we are in deep problem.
So when people argue that there's the role, of course, of the parents as well to control their children, I mean, what role should they be playing?
But we inherit our parents' traumas.
But that's also the role of society. I mean, the parents of this, of Nahel, they've been also growing up marginalized, probably, and that plays a role. Of course, that message is simplifying a fracture that exists, because the two crowdfunding that have been set up both for the boy that was killed and for the policeman really tells the story of this fracture that there is currently in France, and we cannot ignore that there is a fracture.
And we've seen the riots have calmed down, they've boiled down, but this story is going nowhere. I mean, this has been simmering for so long, and it doesn't look like anything could change anytime soon.
I think it's important to contextualize this and not make it about Nahel committing a crime or parents not bringing up their children or society failing. We have to also understand that this is historic in France. We are talking of a country where in the 1960s over 100 persons were killed of Arab descent and thrown in the Seine River. Of course, the state has acknowledged it but has never apologized. This is the same country where in 1983, 3 army soldiers killed a person of color, which was considered as racial profiling. This is the same country where in 2005, 2 teens running away from the police died. This is the same country where in 2016, a person of color died while in custody. This is the same country that in 2020, we saw videos of a black music producer being beaten up by police and tear gas thrown into his studio. This is the same country where over 90% of lives taken over the last recent years are people of color. And black and Arab persons are 20 times more likely to be stopped by the police. So this is systemic. This is not about Nahel. This is not about raising a child correctly. This is about racial profiling, and this is about the French state refusing to recognize that it is promoting racism within society.
And we've heard nothing out of Brussels on this story this week. There's been quietness from the Commission. I mean, should the European Union be standing up more for what we've just heard?
Well, to be honest, I mean, we had the same in Husby in Stockholm a while ago, some years ago, and I was the only politician who went out to that suburb meeting these youngsters, just to say that there is another Sweden that is prepared to listen. It's not only the police that will meet you. And that kind of leadership I lack. Either it is on the level of Brussels or in the level of France. I mean, how many councillors from the local council came to the riot or to these people to talk to them, or how many MPs? I mean, that is what you need, kind of a leadership that is offering another way out. We have to be there where people are, but we do not even consider them as proper voters. Their vote doesn't even matter. And that is the huge problem.
And as we've seen, it's been clearly politicised. I mean, we could see the consequences as well when people go to vote.
And I think that the Commission has not been saying anything also to not further fuel that politizations. And given the fact that Macron is the biggest political player in Europe right now, of course, they don't want to favorize any other opponent of Macron. That plays a key role. And usually the European Commission in Europe doesn't want to meddle when there are internal issues in member countries, rightfully so, because any word can be misinterpreted and can be mistaken and used by opposition parties.
But we also have to address the issue of the far right polarizing our societies, dividing them into two. I mean, that is a responsibility that they have to take. They are out there creating hate speech. They are out there, underbuilding the racism, and then they just go off free. I think that they have to be demanded of responsibility, because they are creating that gap in our societies. They are enlarging.
And a lot of that hate speech and misinformation, of course, is online. And we did hear from the French President Emmanuel Macron playing with the idea of perhaps turning off some of those networks and turning off the internet, in fact, during these situations. That's kind of illegal, though, right? I mean,
it's not only illegal. I think it's a scary thought. I come from Cameroon, a country where the internet has been shut down when protesters go out. I think that to hear a French president or to hear French politicians even play with such use or try to subtly say we are going to turn down the internet, I think speaks a lot to the direction that French society is going to. But we are not surprised, because in the past, when there's been protests, the French politicians have never really listened to people. And this is not only about this protest. We can talk about the Yellow Vest protest. We can talk about the protest recently about the retirement age. So it's a systemic issue where the authorities are not listening to the people. But I'd just like to come back to one question which you raised earlier, what Brussels is doing about this. It's hard to throw stones when you live in a glass house, because the issue of racism in policing is all over Europe. In Belgium, for example, we've seen Facebook groups where police officers are using racial slurs. In Sweden, there were reports of police officers using racial slurs against other police officers. We see the same thing in Hungary, in Poland. So it's really hard to say, France, you need to fix your problems when you have the same problems.
Emmanuel, you mentioned Poland. Quite interestingly, because I don't know if, did you see the tweet the other day from the Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki? Yeah. He shared his thoughts on the situation in France. He put out a tweet comparing his country to France. You can take a look there. He said, our plan is a Europe of security and public order, and these are the values from which everything begins. So making a comparison there between France and Poland in the video, comparing the recent events like the street fires and the looting to almost an idealistic life in Poland. I mean, shocking images.
Let us listen with the women, what they think about Poland, who are denied their autonomous right to decide over their bodies. I don't believe that everyone agrees with him in Poland among his citizens. So I don't.
But Morawiecki is clearly forcing his hand on these topics. There are elections coming up in Poland this fall. I mean, he's trying just to collect more and more consensus. I mean, these are the weapons, the tools that the far right uses. I mean, that's the rhetoric that the far right uses. I'm not surprised, I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised that they're going that far to compare Warsaw with Paris these days. We should be worried when this is going to go too far that we cannot control it anymore, that, it's going to get really out of hand.
And it's worth pointing out that Poland as well, last week at the EU summit in Brussels, was very much opposing the EU Migration Pact. The Swedish Commissioner Ylva Johansson, who's responsible for that hard-fought Migration Pact, was very critical of Poland as well on that. I mean, it's a
rightly so
continuous issue, rightly so, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, well, because I mean, both Poland and Hungary have been very, very problematic and unpragmatic in this in the migration pact, and we cannot keep killing people at sea like that.
I'm afraid that is all we have time for on that topic, but do not go anywhere, because after the break we'll be hearing what European businesses make of the European Commission's Rule of Law report. Stay with us here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, another story that caught our attention this week was Brussels' annual scolding of EU member states for not adhering to the rule of law. Since 2020, the Commission has been drafting yearly reports that hone in on democracy and media issues in countries, and this week said the situation was stable and there'd actually been a little bit of progress, 65% of last year's recommendations. But that corruption was still a very serious concern for 7 in 10 EU citizens, that corruption was widespread in their countries. And they also flagged that the perception of judicial independence had dropped in 13 EU member states. So, first question, have you had a look at this?
Yeah, briefly. It's a quite thick, kind of a document. So I'm looking forward to some reading of it.
I don't think the Commission knows anything else but thick documents, especially when you have to read 27 for the 27 different countries. Did you take a look?
Briefly, I took a look at what was put on the website, the EU website, which was just kind of like a brief overview.
And do you think it's a good exercise? I mean, that's what the crux of the matter is here. Is this a good exercise? It's the fourth time we've seen this annual rule of law.
It is a good exercise. It's always a bit, the Commission, the Europe way of, using the carrot and the stick with member states. Of course, there are infringements. The rule has to be respected. When you're part of a club in the European Union, is part of a club that you join with rules. You need to respect those rules. And if countries do not respect those rules, they need to be reprimanded. But it's also on the other side of the coin is that when you reprimand a country on national matters, there is always the risk that they feel that they've been intruded in their own ruling, in their own laws, and in the way they manage their own country. So, of course, there's always the need to find a balance between using the stick and the carrot. And I think that we saw this also in this report that was published.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we've no poll around the table. We did try to reach out, but we couldn't because, according to the Commission, there was no progress from Poland on 6 recommendations from judicial independence, media freedom and lobbying rules. I mean, it is very concerning.
Yeah, it is. And Poland has been very concerning for a while now. So it's nothing new. Unfortunately, they are not taking any serious steps forward with this government leading, of course. I should not be speaking about the Polish people because it's a different story, but about the government of Poland. And I do believe that this exercise, yearly exercise that we have, it's the way forward because we have to have common standards, and all member states should be judged according to the standards and not according to someone's liking or not liking and opinions, and that creates actually a level, an equal, play field for all member states. So I think the report is very, very important, but the implementation, and this has been symptomatic to this Commission that the implementation of EU legislation has been falling behind when it comes to the implementation.
And that's why Poland, of course, they've had a lot of their funds frozen. As of earlier this year, a combined total of around 138 billion had been withheld from both Poland and Hungary due to violations of the rule of law. But Abir, you mentioned level playing field, and that's, of course, a point that those working in the business community love, this idea of a level playing field, and we wanted to hear their perspective on this EU rule of law report. So I had the chance to speak to the director of Eurocommerce, Christelle Delberge, to hear her take. Take a listen.
Non-respect of the rule of law principle is pretty harmful for business. It creates distrust. It harms competition. It deters investment locally and in the single market. It diverts resources that would be invested in future growth or innovation. It harms the single market, and it harms consumers and businesses for higher prices, lower choice, and lower innovation. And what we're seeing actually is a deterioration of the rule of law environment in Europe.
So Christelle Delberge there from Eurocommerce, that's the voice of retailers and wholesalers like IKEA and like Carrefour she's representing there. And her vision is not as rosy perhaps as that of the European Commission.
Yeah, I mean, the rule of law is very important. I think that, as Abiyo rightly said, it's important that there is a level playing field, but at the same time, I cannot help but, see the hypocrisy of the European Union, because if we are talking about the rule of law, then it has to extend to all aspects of the rule of law. And when we look at migration, for example, and we look at the differential practices in terms of like Ukrainian refugees who were coming into Europe and non-Ukrainian refugees, we see that the rule of law is not applicable in this sense. And so when we talk about the rule of the law, what are we talking about? Is it about the rule of law in certain aspects of society, or is it about the rule of law generally?
Matteo, you've been in Brussels for a long time.
Yeah.
Is the EU hypocritical?
No, I have to take the side of the EU in this case, because I understand that they cannot use the stick too much. I mean, these countries are anyhow governed by prime minister, then they sit in the council, they take decisions together, sometimes on, they can veto those decisions. So there is always, we don't have to forget that there is always a political balance to keep. The European Commission is not a bunch of technocrats that they just have to do analysis. There is also commissioners, there is the body of commission, the European Council. So it is important to keep a dialogue, even with the countries that are right now infringing the rule of law, the media freedom. And of course, it doesn't help to frame this conversation on Poland and Hungary alone, because we have seen in the past other countries, Slovakia, in the past even Malta, about media freedom, protection of journalists, and so forth, because the risk is always that then it's going to be targeted on a specific political family, on political leaders, and then again the discourse is going to be framed towards far-right populism and propaganda.
But just on that point on media freedom and this talk of spying on journalists, it's happening already. We've seen it in Greece, and we've seen member states trying to water down a proposal on media freedom to put an exception there regarding the allowing of wiretapping journalists. So people like me trying to do my job. I mean, like, you can't have that.
That's just unacceptable. I mean, and the technology that is used, they don't even, need a decision by a judge or by a court or anything. It's just up to someone's, opinion and liking to tap you or not tap you. And that is just totally unacceptable. In the union, that is also based on values. I mean, of course, we are internal market, but we're also based on values. And I think that we should strive to have the geographical spot on earth where we have the most free media, the most secured journalists, but also the politicians who see the value of that and wanted to promote these values. Of course, there are independent member states, and we have to remember that the EU is not a federal state. We are not the United States of America. We are United Europe of different states. So keeping the political balance and trying to get people over to that side of values. We are united as different countries. Of course. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for on that topic. We will come back to it, though, and keep an eye on how EU member states digest that rule of law report that came out of Brussels this week. But thank you so much to our guests, and thank you so much for watching. We see you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Hello there, you're watching Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly talk show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my panel, we're dissecting some of the European stories that caught our eye this week. One of them takes us to the sky.
We kindly remind all passengers to turn off all electronic devices or keep them in airplane mode during the entire flight.
That gentle reminder to turn off our phones that we've heard so many times before takeoff could soon be a thing of the past. New rules from the Commission mean that airlines can provide 5G and other mobile technology on board so that we can make calls, send messages and surf as we fly. So the European Commission says that it's great news for business and the sky is no longer the limit. But what's your take? Is it good or bad? Matteo?
Well,
Javier?
Who does even put on flight mode?
I do.
I do as well.
And I'm scared by the idea that, especially on long flights, people will make calls and surf on the internet and have even video calls next to me. Well, I use the time on the plane also to work, to focus, to
relax, right? I like that, like a little bit of time.
Relax. So I'm very scared by the fact that people would use. It's like the metro. Until some years ago, it was not possible underground to have phone calls, and now everyone does that, and it's a bit.
Briefly, your take?
It's scary.
I'm all for freedom, but I think as well that people need to understand that in as much as we have the freedom of choice, whether you want to have the flight mode on and off, or whether you want to browse or not, I think that freedoms come as well with responsibilities, and the duty here is to respect the other passengers close to you. And I think that before such rules are put in place, it's quite important that the society at large is educated well enough to understand that, listen, we have these freedoms, but then we also have to respect other passengers as well.
Yeah, can you imagine the red-eye flight at 6 a.m. and someone talking the whole way over?
No, but I mean, there is a solution to that as well, because in Sweden we have, in the train system, we have a wagon that is silent wagon. So, I mean, you can divide an airplane with, like, if you want to talk and you want to have a conversation out loud, then you will sit in these rows. But if you have a silent one, then...
The planes are pretty small.
Exactly. I don't know.
But there's probably going to be another sort of first class, business class that's going to be sold for more. It's going to be sold for more money.
Yeah, but why
the argument of the Commission here, it's good for business. But the reality as well is that we're all getting pretty addicted to our phones. 8 in 10 of us here in Europe have phones. Many of us can hardly put it down. And we've been taking a look at the impact that's having on our health. According to studies, anxiety, addictive personality, distress, decreased sleep quality. I mean, phone addiction is also a reality, right?
Yeah, of course. I'm totally addicted. So I admit that. And I mean, as we were talking, that I use my flight time to, read an actual book and, just relaxing from that staring at the screen. But at the same time, if people want to do that, I won't be the one that is hindering them from doing that.
So if you're addicted to social networks, has anyone seen Threads, the brand new project of Mark Zuckerberg?
Yes, I downloaded Threads this morning. I was fascinated by the idea. I think that the interface needs a lot more improving. Yeah. But I think, if it is marketed the way it's going to work as an alternative to Twitter, which seems to be like a cesspool these days of far-right rhetoric, then I think it's a much needed, it's much needed, basically.
And Emmanuel, you're not the only one. Millions of people downloaded in just a couple of hours. I mean, could it wipe Twitter off the map?
Great move by Mark Zuckerberg. I think that it was very timed, given all the restrictions that are coming up on Twitter. I think it could potentially. I mean, social media, I think that they have a lifespan. Social media channels, and I think that could be the time that we see the downfall of Twitter.
Will there be another app for you to download and get addicted to?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was totally addicted to Twitter before, but then it became that cesspool of I don't know who. It was, it was a hostile takeover. But all the journalists are on Twitter, so if the journalists don't move to the thread, maybe I won't move either, because I want to reach out with my message. So it has to be,
So there you go, something for people to look up. Thank you so much for those insights. Thank you to our guests, to Emmanuel Ashiri from Inar, to Abir Al-Salani and to Matteo Albania. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you for watching. If you want to reach out to us here at Brussels My Love, our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. You can also find us on social media, on Instagram and Twitter, not Threads just quite yet. But see you soon here on Euronews and euronews.com.